Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to lecture today. As I said, today is going to be a recorded lecture, which you already know if you're watching this now. A few things about today's lecture. So typically when we do recorded lectures, the good news is it can go a little bit faster. You'll notice I'm going to move through the material a little faster. I will stop at times and say, okay, here's what I want you to do now, or pause the video and do this. Totally up to you how you'd like to go through this. If you want to listen to it a little bit faster, a little bit slower, of course, you can do that on your end. You can stop it and rewind it, listen to something again if it didn't make sense. So we will kind of just plow ahead in that regard. But of course, you can stop and step away from it at any time. I will just continue all the way from start to finish in this, so it can be time efficient as well. A few housekeeping things I want to talk about. Obviously, I would ask if there are question concerns now. If there are, you can certainly still email me if there's a pressing issue. Otherwise, we can deal with it when I get back. I do want to point out if there's questions that you have, you think your classmates might be able to help you with. Discussion board is a great place to put that, particularly when we're talking about the readings. I encourage you, even though we're not there together to do it this week, get together with a group of friends, go through the questions, make sure you're getting it, challenge each other. Also, I'm getting a number of emails for people who have accommodations for the exams and whatnot. So those all will be on file. However, I just want to point out, I leave it with you. It is your responsibility to make sure I am aware of any accommodations you need that are special as we get into the exams and in-class assignments and those kind of things. Unfortunately, the one thing that does not work well when we do these recorded lectures is Kahoot. So we'll skip that for this week, but we will come back to it. Okay, so today our questions for the lecture are going to be, first of all, we're going to review the physiologic and metabolic changes. And when we think about your typical or your classic endurance exercise training, so your long, slow distance type exercise, what are the things that are going to change? And then we're going to put a bit of a spin on that to figure out how we can make it better. And in that regard, a question will be, does the type of training, and we can change all different types of things, we can change the actual modality, we can change the intensity, we can change the frequency, all of those. So the type, the magnitude, and the time course of the response, are they going to be different based on how we do it? I love this video of two guys. This is a parody of doing CrossFit. And it's not that I particularly hate CrossFit, it just makes me laugh. But when you think about, new training modalities, well, what is new about CrossFit? Is there something new about this type of training where we're adding this aerobic component to resistance training? And what are the effects of that going to be? So I want to start with classic training by looking at what is truly a classic study. Without exaggeration, I actually have a copy of this study on my desk at this time. It is a fantastic study and a really good research group. I encourage you, if you want to go back to some of the seminal literature, this is a good place to start. And what they did here in this study is they looked at what happens when we train people at a relatively moderate intensity. So they did 1 hour at 75% intensity 4 times a week for 5 months, which is pretty impressive. When you look at what most studies do these days, 8 to 12 weeks is pretty good. Getting people to do this for 5 months is really quite impressive. And so really that exercise back in 1973, moderate intensity, we're really talking about jogging. Or jogging, if you will. So if we look here at table 1 that I'm presenting to you, you can see we have a few different things that are presented. First of all, I'll point out, back in the day, this used to be acceptable. This would no longer fly anymore. But here they have the subject on the left-hand side, and you see these letters here. These actually represent the initials of the people who are in the study. Nowadays, Research Ethics Board, they do not like that. We should not be making data available that somebody could recognize from somebody else. Interestingly enough, I just reread this paper about a month ago, and it had never occurred to me that these initials actually line up with the authors of the study. So they actually put themselves in the study, which is another interesting point. But what we can see there as we move our way across, there's B's and A's on each of these columns, the B representing the before value, the A representing the after value, so it's like your pre-post. And in column number 1 here, we have VO2 max. Moving across, we have SDH activity. I'll come back to that in a second. I just want to put this up. SDH is succinate dehydrogenase, which is an oxidative enzyme you'll recognize from reviewing the Krebs cycle. And beside that, we have phosphofructokinase, which is more of a glycolytic enzyme. And then in the far column, we have muscle glycogen. So when we go across, we can see here that sure enough, if we start looking at fitness VO2, they moved from 3.9 liters per minute to 4.5. Now that value may not mean a whole lot to you if you're not used to looking at absolute values. So just to making it something that makes a little more sense to most people, I took the weight of an average man and divided that out. So that means they started at 52 mils per kilogram per minute and moved all the way up to a 60. So 52 is no slouch to begin with, and they got themselves quite fit. So I think that's a really important thing to focus on. When we look at what happened with oxidative and as well as glycolytic enzymes, we can see that both went up significantly. So SDH went from roughly 4.5 to 9, so almost a doubling of succinate dehydrogenase activity. And when we look at PFK, similar pattern here, almost a doubling of what we had there. And lastly, when we look over here to the final column, muscle glycogen, we can see that it went from 72 to 182. So sure enough, just as we talked about before, there are things that can change these variables, such as the amount of glycogen that can be held in the muscles, training being one of them, carb loading being another. Are there other likely adaptations? Well, I think we can certainly all agree that there would be. This is specifically a muscle physiology paper. But when we think about the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the strength of the muscles and FMD and all those things moving around, of course, those are going to change as well. So given that we are talking about skeletal muscle fiber, one of the things they looked at in the study is what happens in terms of fiber types. And hopefully this is a bit of a review for you, but you can see we do have two types of fibers. We can talk about those which are primarily glycolytic and those which are more oxidative. And we know that exercise training can certainly move from the left side of this to the right side. So we can take fibers that are really anaerobic and they're glycolytic and move them. They don't totally convert, but maybe they become more oxidative in the way that they present. So when we think about our glycolytic fibers, they really are designed for anaerobic glycolysis, meaning there are power fibers. So they don't have a lot of mitochondria because there isn't a use for that. We're not putting things through the Krebs cycle. Diameter of these fibers can be quite large in comparison to those that are more oxidative. And the big reason for that is because they're power. They don't need oxygen to do their thing. They can produce a lot of force because they don't actually have to get anything in from the outside, such as oxygen and nutrients, to the inside for them to be able to do their thing. As a result, that means they are going to tire more quickly because they're not using oxygen in that process. And of course, if they're using glycogen, then they have a lot of glycolytic enzymes and a lot of stores right there. To contrast that, if we think about the oxidative fibers, of course, they're relying on oxidative phosphorylation, which means they have a lot of mitochondria. They're very resistant to fatigue. And as a result, they're going to have a small diameter, which is functional. Because if they're smaller and the blood is coming from the outside of these cells, then we don't want it to have to diffuse too far to get in to actually get that oxygen to the middle. So they're going to be smaller, lots of capillaries around them, and they have a lot of myoglobin, which is what makes them red. I'd love to give this lecture in close proximity to Thanksgiving because it always ruins somebody's Thanksgiving dinner. But I think it's a neat example. When we think about where white meat and dark meat comes from a turkey, this really sort of shows the difference between glycolytic and oxidative fibers. Now, obviously turkeys that are raised in captivity, they don't fly very much. So they don't actually use their wings all that much. Thus, they have really glycolytic fibers. They have white meat in their breast meat because they don't use that to get around. In contrast, their leg muscles, which is about the only thing they can use when they're running around the barn, they become far more oxidative. So what do we see there? Well, they have much more myoglobin, and so these oxidative fibers are the dark, tasty meat. So there you go. And if we look behind the turkey there, you can see this is a before and after taken from this Golnick paper, where we can see what's happening in terms of the presentation of these fibers. Hard to see differences in changes in terms of the size, but you can certainly see that they got a whole lot darker. What's causing that? Greater perfusion, greater capillarity, and a lot more myoglobin because those fibers are becoming more oxidative and able to use oxygen for phosphorylation. So this leads to the question then, what's the signal? What's the thing that the body senses to cause these changes from exercise to occur? And if we take that to the applied example, and we can identify that signal, we can start to manipulate what's that thing so we can trick the body into really exaggerating those responses that we want. And something that's been proposed has been muscle glycogen. It seems reasonable that this might be a signal because we see when we train, it goes up. We know that when we deplete it, performance goes down. And so the idea here is maybe low muscle glycogen concentration will be the thing that triggers everything else. We know that it enhances transcription of a number of genes involved in the training response. So maybe if we change that, we're going to get a bigger bang for a buck. Thus, the question, could training with low muscle glycogen enhance the molecular response to exercise training and in turn improve performance? Or is it the trigger to a greater response to this exercise stimulus? We talked about this a little bit before. There are athletes now that do this train low, compete high idea. Or they might train low in the morning because they fasted at night and then they train high later. There's a group from Scandinavia, and these are some giants in the field, particularly the last two authors here. Bente Peterson is still publishing today. Ben Saltine died about 2 or 3 years ago, but truly did some of the seminal work on this and really fascinating stuff. And this is just a good example of one of those studies they did. So here's what they hypothesized. They believe that training with low muscle glycogen will enhance the oxidative capacity of a muscle. It's like anything else, it's another stressor, and when the body is faced with that stressor, it's either going to break down or it's going to get better at it. And so they believe it's going to cause greater adaptation. They measured this 2 ways. So CS being citrate synthase, again, an oxidative marker, an oxidative enzyme, or they looked at BHAD or beta-HAD, which is beta hydroxy acyl dehydrogenase, again, an oxidative marker. They also said, okay, well, it's one thing to understand what's going on with enzymatic activity, which is signaling what's going on at the level of the muscle, or it could be going on. Another thing to look at the actual performance, because the proof is in the pudding. So what they wanted to do here is they were going to train people, and I'll show you this. They're going to train them in 2 different ways, either with low or with high glycogen for their 2 different legs. And so for performance, what they did is they measured maximum power output and how long could they sustain that with their leg for in a time to exhaustion test. So here's the intervention. In this, they had everybody be part of 2 groups. So since people have 2 legs, one leg was put in one group, one leg was put in the other, with one being high glycogen, the other being low glycogen. In the high glycogen, that meant that leg would train 1 time per day, every day. So you train, you take the rest of the day off. In that time, you would expect your leg would recover, we'd replenish the glycogen, come back the next day, refreshed, ready to go, do it again. The other leg trained twice a day, every other day. So that means that both the legs ended up doing the same amount of work, but if you're in the second group, you train in the morning, did not have a chance to replenish that glycogen, train again at night, take the next day off, start fresh again. So in one, you're always training fresh, if you will, that's our high glycogen. In the other, you're training twice a day so that at least one of those workouts, you're doing it with low glycogen. Again, very similar to what we're now seeing going on in terms of fasted training and stuff. So here they had 7 trained subjects, which doesn't seem like a lot, but in this kind of study, it's actually acceptable just based on the invasiveness of what they had to do. It's pretty good. And you can see the device they used here. They used a chronometer on this, and they basically took an exercise bike and they put a boot on it, and you can see it was an active. So when they kicked their leg out, they'd have to go against the force, and then it would passively swing back in. If this doesn't totally make sense of what's going on here, it's a solid rod coming from the back of the boot, and then it's connected with a pivot around where it says ergometer crank. Everybody's probably seen these types of bikes before at the gym. They're still popular today. These are Swedish-made bikes. And you can see here they have a weight stack right up here at the front. And so that's where you change the resistance and stuff. So basically what they did is they took this and attached it to where the pedal would be. And then as you kick forward, it would swing this way. And then the weight of it is just going to pull it around back. So that's basically what it is. That's how they did kicking. Just as an interesting aside, we still use these types of devices today. And in fact, we're taking some of our very expensive bikes that we have in the lab now and trying to adapt them to do exactly this using their same model. So what did they find? Here I'm showing you the changes in enzyme activity after the training. And what we can see is whether we're looking at citrate synthase or HAD, we can see that there are differences. All the groups went up. Training enzymes went up in both groups because these are changes. But we see that the improvement in the group that trained in the low condition tended to be higher. Now in the beta-HAD, it's not significantly higher, but we can see there's certainly a trend. And we look at CS, citrate synthase on the left there, is quite pronounced. So training with a low muscle glycogen seems to cause that enzymatic activity to change when we look at the muscle tissue itself. So what about performance measures? It's one thing to look at, we'll call it the metabolic soup, but what if we actually look what happened here? So maybe give a second, take a look at this, pause it if you need to. I want you to try and determine what you see coming out of the performance work here. Okay, I'm going to assume that you stopped it and had a chance to think about it there. If you didn't, you can still hit pause now. Here's what jumps out to me. I'm going to start here at the parameter. It says P max, so that's the power max that was put out. We can think of it just as it would be done on a bike, and it's measured in watts. And we can see at pre-training here, the group that trained low, or the leg that trained low versus the leg that trained high, pretty similar, okay? No real difference there. And when we look at post-training, we can see that both went up. So the first thing I take from that is it doesn't really matter how you do it. If your intention is to get a higher max power, you can increase your power as long as you train. It doesn't matter if you have high or low glycogen. However, if we go down and we look at the next line, which is time to exhaustion measured in minutes, and if we look at total work, we can see that the low group here has a significant difference compared to the high group. So the low group went from 5 to almost 20, and we can see that the high group, in terms of their minutes, time to exhaustion, went from 5.5 to almost 12. Okay, so 4 times the change in the low group and about a doubling in the high group. And then when we multiply that out, the total work, so if you look at their max power, how long they can hold that, you can see that absolutely that holds true in the total work done in that time. So what would we say? Well, training improved performance in both groups as well, but the improvements, again, seem to be better in the group that trained with low muscle glycogen. So if you train twice a day, we were getting a bigger bang for our buck for doing the exact same amount of work. So what does this mean? Should we be telling all our athletes that they should train twice a day, or do it every other day, or be doing this other type of fasted training, which we saw another way to drive down glycogen? Based on the results of this trial, using untrained men, we see that absolutely when you train with lower muscle glycogen, that seems to be the case. However, a few things I want to point out. This is a well-done study, and I think taken in context, it tells us a lot. But we do have to think about other things like, who does this actually work for? So great that it worked in untrained men. Does it work in people who are already trained individuals? As it turns out, the answer to that is probably now we know yes. But at the time, we didn't know that, so we don't want to just jump to that conclusion. Also, how long can we do this type of training for? We did already touch on this a little bit too. This is not the kind of thing you can do indefinitely. It's a stress like anything else. And if you overdo that stress, the body will break down. So how do we work that in? How do we periodize that in? Does this translate to practical tests? I think it's a really neat method that they came up with here where they're doing the kicking and they're really only looking at the concentric phase, but it doesn't really mimic any real sport. So what if we take that to cycling or running or swimming or any other sport we think of? How does it actually roll over? And we can think of a ton of other questions that really speak to what's the ecological validity and what are the things that we don't know about this? What do we still need to figure out? Also, is it optimized? Is training twice a day the best way to do it? What if maybe we train 3 times a day? So we got 1 session that sort of depleted the glycogen and then 2 that we're already done in low. Is that going to be even better? We still don't know. So again, proof of concept, but when we go to apply this, we really need to think about what do we know? What don't we know? What are the next questions? So we kind of touched on this idea then, if we can understand what the signal is that triggers these responses, whether they be a classic endurance type exercise or something else, then maybe we can optimize this training response. And I want to take a quick second here to talk about some of the work that my lab has been doing over the last number of years, which is looking at this idea of blood flow restriction. And I know what you're thinking, this looks terrible. You can see here this guy has a weight in either hand, and it looks like a blood pressure cuff on either arm. It's actually connected to a Hokuston, which is a rapid cuff inflator. And essentially what blood flow restricted training is, it's stopping complete flow to a muscle. So we're not occluding it, we're not going above systolic pressure, but we're cutting off about 80% of the flow. So some of the oxygenated blood is getting in, but really what we're doing is we're stopping blood on the venous side from getting out. And you can see here, we can now do this with resistance training. We can also do it with more aerobic type training. And it's a really fascinating and fairly new area where we've realized that we can start to get these really exaggerated responses that we wouldn't otherwise get. Now, before I go into explaining how to do all this stuff, particularly because I'm not there to ask questions, I think it's an intriguing area. As I said, my group has done a fair bit of work on this lately, and I'd be happy to discuss it with you. This is my caution. Please don't go try this on your own until you know what the risks are and how we should actually do this appropriately and how you should occlude and not occlude and what pressures and where to put it and all that kind of stuff. There are lots of things in here, and it can be dangerous if done incorrectly, but I do think it's a pretty cool area that I'd be happy to talk about further. So let's just explore this a little bit. Here's the basic idea of blood flow restricted, or sometimes you hear called occlusion training or Katsu training, as it came from Japan. The basic idea here is that we can use very light loads, maybe 25–30% of what would typically be used from a 1RM, and we can still have an effect in terms of hypertrophy, in terms of strength, if we've occluded blood flow when we lift that. So if we look at the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines, it's typically recommended you need to lift around 75% or more of your 1RM if you really want to cause those changes in strength. There's a number of people in society, whether they're rehabbing or elderly or anything else you can think of, where lifting heavy weights is just not a great option. There's also athletes at times where maybe they can't risk the injury or the overuse or whatever it might be. So lifting light could be good. But when you lift particularly light, we know there's not much of a change usually. And if we look back to some of the early literature back in about 2000, so this is by Takarada and his colleagues in 2002, what they did is they had groups lift about 25% of 1RM, and they saw that if they just lifted that, there was no change in strength. However, when they occluded blood flow, they saw that there was a drastic difference. So 14% increase in knee extensor strength if they'd cut off blood flow before lifting that same amount of weight. So there seems to be something about cutting off blood flow that changes the metabolic stress. And we think this is fascinating, and my group's really working to try to optimize how that goes. A few years back, a PhD student of mine, in 2015, we did what's called a systematic review. So just as a quick overview of the concept here, instead of just giving a review of the literature that's out there from our perspective and what we believe to be correct, instead we did research of the research. So essentially in a systematic review, you come up with search terms and you methodically go through and you find everything that fits your criteria. And then you take a look at that and you combine it all. And we did do a meta-analysis in that where instead of having 10 or 20 people in each study, we took all of the studies that fit our inclusion criteria and reran the stats on everybody to see what we thought the effects were. And when we did it, we were looking at the way this is typically done, which is an occlusive cuff. So here you can see a thin Katsu band is put on there. Oftentimes we will use, we now use automated tourniquets, but you can use blood pressure cuffs and other wraps just to reduce the flow, as I said. And typically you're going to put that proximal and you're going to work out a muscle that is distal to where you've slowed the blood flow. So you get this pooling below, and sure enough, we see that it does seem to be effective, both in terms of causing muscle hypertrophy and in terms of strength. What are some of the advantages? Well, you can specifically target a muscle. My group is quite interested in this to understand what's the value here in basically extending a workout, whether that be a resistance exercise or maybe you went and did a run and you want to lower the wear and tear on your knees and your ankles, for example, but you still want to really stress the muscles. We think that's an interesting idea. It can certainly be time efficient. It's applicable to a lot of people, and we might be able to augment or supplement training that's already there. I will point out at this point, there's been some recent work that's done that does show, however, when we're doing blood flow restriction, yes, there are some good effects, and it might get to be almost as good as lifting heavy. But particularly when we look at the rehab world, it seems that if you are able to lift heavy, you're probably better to just lift heavy. I don't think this is a panacea. As I said, I'm not a big proponent of magical solutions that your doctor doesn't want you to know about. But I do think there might be something here, and I think there are potential ways to use this. Now, do I think everybody should be doing it? No, I don't. I actually think you probably lift heavy most of the time if that fits your goals. But I do think there are times where this maybe is kind of the icing on the cake, if you will. I mentioned that in our study, we did a systematic review to look at what happens when we do it the way most people do. We looked at the distal muscles. There was a group that came up with they did a systematic review as well that same year, and they looked at what happens to the muscles that are on the other side of the cuff. Just as a point of interest, we were pretty surprised to see this as well. It turns out that those muscles get stronger as well. Probably has less to do with metabolic changes that are happening on the other side of the cuff and more to do with the fact that when you fatigue the muscles because you're wearing a cuff, you have to recruit muscles in a different pattern. So one of the findings they had in here was what happens to pec muscles when you use this on the arms. Obviously, you can't slow blood flow to the pec muscles because they're attached to your rib cage. But they did find when people put cuffs on their arms, pec muscles still got stronger, and they think it's probably because the triceps fatigue and thus the pecs pick up more of the work. So an interesting sort of side note there. So where have we gone with this now? I wanted to show this. This is actually a few years old, if I'm quite honest with you, but it's an area that we're still working on, and we're actually we're kind of bringing back to life. And this is very much related to what Jeremy is going to be talking about in the guest lecture next week. So what happens when we take a passive stimulus, like electrical stimulation of a muscle, and then we apply it with blood flow restriction? Traditionally, we've known that if you use Dr. Hose, like the electrical stims that you see on late night television, you don't actually turn into He-Man. They don't make you huge and ripped, mostly because you can't shock somebody. People won't allow you to shock them to the extent that it would take to actually cause muscle to grow significantly or to get way stronger. However, we looked at this and said, well, then what happens if we augment the efficacy of that fairly low intensity stimulus by cutting off blood flow first?
Tell me what's happening to you right now.
Well, my muscles are contracting and I'm not controlling it. So there's just electrical stimulation getting put into my muscles in my arms and legs. And it's causing what looks like a twitch, but it's just a muscle contraction.
What does it feel like?
It doesn't really feel like a whole lot of anything once you get used to kind of seeing what it looks like. It doesn't feel like anything. It doesn't really hurt. It's just kind of happening, I guess.
And can you explain what exactly they've done to you to make this happen?
Well, Josh has put on electrical probes, 2 on each of my arms and 4 on my legs. And then we turn up the electrical current so that it gets a visual contraction so we know it's working. And then he's put a blood pressure cuff on my right arm and my left leg. And so we turn those on, so I restrict blood flow to my limbs for about 5 minutes and then turn it off for 5 minutes. And I do that for a half an hour, 4 times a week.
Okay, so there you go. That was one of the first studies that we did where we tried to see, can we make people bigger and stronger while they're basically just sitting there and we're making their muscles work for them. The short answer is yes, we can. So Jeremy's going to be talking about the next steps of how do we start to use this. Obviously, there's rehab applications, maybe for people in comas, people before they're ready to start traditional rehab. And now Jeremy's going to take it to the next step, which is understanding what might be the use in cardiometabolic conditions like diabetes. So what about other work patterns? We've talked about classic. I've given you sort of a novel take here on something that my group is interested in, but certainly those aren't the only ways we can work out. And if we think more about the aerobic exercise spectrum, this is kind of what we've talked about already. Classic moderate intensity exercise where you choose a load, it's relatively light, and it keeps going for a really long time. I'm sure most people here have heard about high intensity interval training, this idea that you're going to work hard and rest in between. And you may or may not have heard of sort of a different take on that, which we'll call sprint interval training, where essentially you're working at a really high workload, which is not sustainable for a very long time. So much longer rests in between, work hard, rest. That's the basic idea with all interval training, is it's going to be this relatively brief burst, high intensity, and then there's rest in between. I like this chart. I think this is an important one that you should get your head around. When we compare endurance training to HIIT or sit, what are the differences we see in terms of physiological adaptations and the way it's presented in the literature? So if we think about endurance training in general, we can see the overview here. You're typically training for 1 to 2 hours. If you look at Canadian guidelines, that sort of lines up with what we tell people, 60 to 70% of VO2 max. And that training is recommended on most, if not all days of the week. So we'll call it 5 days a week. The volume ends up being quite high because you're working at a relatively low intensity. So you have to do it pretty often. The training duration, if we look at the literature, is commonly 6 to 8 weeks. And that's kind of what we need to see some changes, which is why studies fall in there. And if we look at the magnitude, typically we're going to see a mean change in a group from 15 to 25%. Obviously, it depends on who they are and where they started. Some of the genetic data suggests that it could be much larger for individuals, but that's sort of our group mean that we'd expect. And we can see the enzymatic activity that goes with that. So things like CS that we've already talked about in this lecture might change from 25 to 30%. If we add that up and we say, okay, what's the total amount of work that you need to do, time spent exercising to see those changes, we'll call that roughly 50 hours. Okay. Let's move over one column to high intensity interval training. Just an interesting point. That guy on the bike there is Dr. Marty Gabala, who is well known. You may have heard of the Gabala workouts or Tabata. He's sort of the other guy. He happens to be Canadian as well. And so when we think about HIIT and we compare that to endurance training, we see bouts are going to be much shorter, much higher intensity. So we're talking 85, 90% VO2 max, 4-minute work, 2-minute rest. That's just one example. We'll talk about there's different ways we can do that. But what I really want to point out is the frequency of this is typically no more than 3 times a week. That's not just because that's how people decide to do it. That's also a practicality thing. If we start doing really high intensity exercise more than that, people get burned out, they get immunosuppressed, and they get sick. So that's not a very good training methodology when it's not sustainable and leads to injury or illness. So we're talking less of it, but a little bit harder. And if we compare that to sprint interval training, in the last column, we can see much less, 4 to 6 bouts. And the workload is spread out much differently. So 30 seconds all out, 4 minutes rest, as opposed to if we look at HIIT, 4 minutes of work, 2 minutes rest kind of thing. And you can see here, really high intensity, 250% of the power output that we considered for VO2 max. And again, 3 times a week is about the max you could do. If we look at the training volume, we would call high intensity interval training sort of moderate in its exposure, whereas sit would be the lowest. So high endurance, moderate HIIT, low sit. We can get these changes in a much shorter time. So we're looking at about 2 weeks when we're talking interval training. HIIT has been pretty well shown to be quite comparable in terms of the magnitude of changes in aerobic fitness. So 15 to 25%, 25 to 35% in the enzymes. Essentially, the story that's often sold is HIIT is just as effective as endurance training in less time. And I think that's very attractive to a number of people. If we look at sprint interval training, the changes in VO2 max may be less, but the time spent actually getting there is far less. So perhaps that's not surprising. Interestingly, though, we see the metabolic stress is probably much higher because we see the enzymes respond to a greater extent. So if we extend that out beyond the 2 weeks, it's interesting to say, well, what would we see? But importantly, when we look at the time to see changes, so 50 hours for endurance training, it's less than a tenth of that for high intensity training, and way less than that when we crank the intensity up for sprint interval training. So that is a chart that you should definitely be familiar with. Get your head around what are the different things, how do they change, what does it mean? Okay, I want to switch gears here a little bit because recently I was reading Women's Health, as I do, maybe, and came across this article. And I think this article is an interesting point. And this is just one, but we can think of this kind of stuff happens all the time in popular health magazines. I'm sure we could go grab one off the shelf of any grocery store and find something similar. And this one caught my eye because Women's Health was claiming they found an article or they found a way to accomplish your goal of banishing belly fat. I also chose this one because I was particularly interested because this was actually based on a study that was done at the University of Guelph, actually in the lab that I now run before I got there, by a PhD student and a few professors who you might know. So that's Dr. Jason Talanian on the left. The guy in the middle is George Hagenhauser. He's the guy I mentioned. He does many of our biopsies with the massive hands, and he just squeezes the meat in when he does it himself. And on the right is somebody you may have already met or you will get to meet, Dr. Lawrence Spreet, who is kind of known as the Gatorade guy and a prolific researcher himself. So these guys had actually run the study, as I said, at Guelph, looking at this idea of what's the change in high intensity aerobic training, and what does that do for fat oxidation? And this is what Women's Health was studying. So what did they find? This is what was reported in Women's Health. To accomplish goal 3 of banishing belly fat, you should do speed intervals. A study from Canada found that exercisers who did 30-minute workouts, including short, hard efforts, lost 3 times as much fat in 15 weeks as their peers who performed steady-paced, easier workouts for 45 minutes. Technically, you burn more fat as fuel during low-intensity exercise, explains researcher Jason Talanian, who did a series of studies on interval training at the University of Guelph in Ontario. But you become a better fat burner overall, even when resting, by raising your fitness ceiling, which you do by going fast. Specifically, Talanian found that interval training increases your cell's fat-frying ability, because that's the kind of language that scientists use, by up to 50%. And because they're harder to do than pokey one-speed workouts, your body takes longer to return to normal after you're done, meaning you keep torching calories long after you've showered. As a belly busting something or other, it keeps going. You get the idea. So let's take a look at what they actually did. So here's the study. I pulled this right out of the paper. Let's first go through their protocol. I'll point out they were using recreationally active women, and they did this for 2 weeks. So the first thing they did is they had them come in and do a VO2 peak test. So they had to figure out how fit are they. And from that, they did a 1-hour cycling test at 60% of what they're capable of, shown from the VO2 peak or max. Then they went into the HIIT training. So over 2 weeks or 14 days, they did this every other day. So they got in 7 sessions, right? 14 divided by 2 is 7 sessions. And then at the end of that, they did another 60-minute, relatively low-intensity, hour-long pedal where they were looking at substrate use. And then, again, they repeated the test to see how fit they were compared to when they started. Okay? So the key measures in these subjects who were their own controls, okay, because they had that on them, VO2 peak, what was their fitness? What were they using to fuel exercise when they were doing relatively light, 60% for an hour? They used RER to get that from a metabolic cart, and then they also measured oxidative enzymes. So what did they find here? HIIT training increases fatty acid oxidation. Okay. They also found that the oxidative enzyme capacity certainly went up as well. So if we look on the left here, we can see this is total oxidation, and we can see pre-training to post-training, there's really not much of a difference. That slight decrease is probably just error in the measure. But when we look at the breakdown of where did this come from, well, in pre-training, a big amount was carbohydrate oxidation, and a much smaller amount was fat oxidation, because if we put that together, that equals the total. And if we look at what happened post-training, we can see there's a bit of a switch. So carb use went down, fat use went up. So essentially, they're meeting those energetic demands of total oxidation by burning more fat. So there it is there. That's really what this article was focusing on. And if we look at the oxidative enzymes, as I said, 2 that we've already looked at before, we can see that post-training, both of them went up, which is what we expected, and that's good. That sort of makes sense. So did Women's Health accurately give the results of this when they reported on it? Well, let's go through a few things here. So this is what I read to you before. Let's maybe pick through some of their claims here. Lost 3 times as much fat in 15 weeks as their peers. Well, interestingly, if you go through, they actually didn't measure belly fat, and you recall that burned belly fat was the thing that they were selling. So no measures of that. In fact, they didn't measure body comp, and they didn't measure waist circumference. They didn't even measure body weight at all. So an interesting thing here. You can see that there's a story that they're trying to sell, because what do people who are picking up Women's Health want to read about? Well, clearly they think it's about things like, how do we do spot reduction, which, by the way, we can all accept, and hopefully we already know, you can't preferentially burn fat from any one part of your body. We don't have control over that. Doing sit-ups, for example, does not change belly fat. Neither does this. Fatty acid oxidation is something very different from changing body weight. So I'm not going to give them full marks on that one. Here, I think this is an interesting point. Technically, you burn more fat as fuel during low-intensity exercise. And that's absolutely true. And Jason Delaney knows what he's talking about. But the application of that is something totally different. We see that the high-intensity interval training did increase fatty acid oxidation during a 1-hour ride. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're burning more fat. He does point out, again, correctly, that you become a better fat burner overall. So maybe this has to do with your ability to burn fat just as the preferential energy, and not about actually getting rid of fat, because this happens even when you're resting, and this is really just changing metabolism all around. And this, to me, really gets to this idea of the fat burning zone. So I want to take a second and let's talk about that. So does it matter if we're burning more fat? I mean, if they'd done those measures, or maybe if they carried it for longer, would we have seen changes in belly fat? Well, probably not. But might we have seen preferential changes in body composition and waist circumference and fat loss? Well, let's see what we think. Fat burning zone. So how do we get at that? What they did in that study, and what we can do in essentially any study we want to look at this, whether it's like we're doing it at resting, shown on the left, we can do resting metabolism, or basal metabolic rate, resting metabolic rate, or we can do it during exercise. And you've probably started to play with this at least a little bit in the exercise lab. So we can use the respiratory exchange ratio to figure out, are we burning carbohydrates or are we burning fats? We know that not a lot of it is going to be protein because that is negligible, so we can essentially forget about it. But we can figure out, based on the amount of oxygen that's being used, from the percentage of the volume of carbon dioxide produced to the oxygen being used, what's the substrate that's being used at a given intensity or rest to actually fuel metabolism under the hood. This can get a little bit complex. This is not a biochemistry lecture, so I'll go through this pretty fast. If it doesn't make sense, I'll just leave it at, just trust me, this proof kind of shows you where it comes from. If chemistry is your thing, then great, you can follow along. But essentially, as I said, fat and carbohydrates are going to differ in the amount of oxygen used to break them down. Also, they're going to differ in the amount of carbon dioxide produced. And that's why VCO2 over VO2 works. And essentially, if we balance the equation for fat, so fat is C16H32O2, you can see there when we go through oxidation and we change that, we can move everything around and we end up with a VCO2 over VO2 of 16 over 23. And if we divide that out, it gives us 0.7. Okay. Conversely, if we take glucose, C6H12O6, and we oxidize it and we come up with it, we end up with 6CO2, 6O2. You divide 6 by 6, you get 1. So what does that mean? Well, this is where we come up with these charts that I imagine most of you have probably seen before, where we can say, okay, an RER of 0.7 means we're burning essentially 100% fat and no carbs. And if we go to the other end, for what I just showed you, if we had an RER of 1, that means we're burning no fat and all carbs. And then we can use that to sort of estimate where we'd be in between. So if you're at a 0.8, you're burning about 2/3 fat, 1/3 carbohydrate, and so on and so forth. So that's how that works. It's really just a balancing of what's going to happen during oxidation. If we get above 1, which is certainly possible, and when we think about what's going on in like a VO2 test, for example, in my lab, I tell people to look for, when they get up to about 1.1, 1.15, occasionally we'll see people hit 1.2, they're done. Like, that they're getting done, and that's sort of, a warning sign that things are about to slow down quickly for that person on the treadmill or on the bike. How is that possible? Well, because at that point, they're working at 100% max. Okay, so they're using all the carbs that they can because it's the only energy source that's going to supply it, and then they pull in anaerobic sources as well, which is how we can work when we're talking about high intensity interval training or sprint interval training. That's how you can work above 100% VO2 max. And if we represent that graphically, I like this because I think it really gets the point across. We can see that the relative contribution of fat or carbohydrate is really going to change as we change the intensity of the exercise. So rarely are we actually using pure fat or pure carbs. I mean, we can kind of express it that way, but I like this because let's look at fat when we start. So we've got exercise intensity as a percent of max across the x-axis, and we have the contribution percentage. And if we start with fat, you can see when we're working at a very low intensity, so let's call it 10%, it probably starts out there. We're using primarily fat as a fuel source and a little bit of carbs. And as we move from low to moderate, you can see the percentage contribution from fat is going to drop off. And as we get up to high, it's going to drop off even further, whereas that's going to be picked up by carbohydrates. So when we go from low to moderate, carbohydrate goes up, and then it goes up the highest when we get to high. So we've talked about this idea of, can we become better fat burners? Yes, we can. But why do we need that? Well, we need carbs to really fill us in. We get to mobilize those energy stores when we get up to really high intensity exercise. So I'm sure that many of you have seen some version of this in a gym that you've been in before. This idea of the cardio zone, they used to be on every treadmill. I think they still are on a number of them. But this idea that, we can look at age, and then we can look at heart rate, and we can figure out when you're working, what zone are you working in? I like this one on the left. This is definitely off a treadmill built in the 80s, where we've got the maximum fat burning zone at the bottom. And then if you work a little bit harder, we can get up to 85%, which is our max cardio zone, and then the danger zone, which is awesome. I'm only ever going to work out in the danger zone from now on. First of all, let's just talk. Is there a danger to working and pushing up towards max heart rate? No, unless you have some kind of underlying pathology where you can't supply the myocardium with the oxygen it needs. But for most people, there's absolutely nothing to that. I find that's a prevalent myth. I've certainly had people come to me and say, my husband works out. Should he be wearing a heart rate monitor? Is his heart going to explode or stop? And the answer is no. So an interesting thing. We probably don't need to discourage people from working hard, particularly when we're talking about interval training where they spend very little time there and come back down. There's probably a little danger to most people. But there's this idea, and really I just showed you some evidence that it may somewhat be supported in science, because I just finished telling you that if you work at a lower percentage of your max, whether it be max VO2 or max heart rate, because they're going to be linearly related, then you are actually burning a greater percentage of fat. So is the fat burning zone real? Should we be working at a lower intensity so we burn more fat? The short answer is no. The long answer is no. And I'll show you why. Because even though that's true, it's a really bad application of the science, okay? Because what happens is, yes, you're burning a greater percentage of fat, but you're just burning less energy overall, and thus less fat. So let's put some numbers to that to make that make sense. And the way I'd express that first one, you can see here, the percentage of fat changes, but so does the absolute amount. So if you're working at a low percentage of your VO2 max, for example, you could be burning 75% fat. And let's say you burn 10 calories. 75% of 10 calories would be 7.5 calories. If you were to work at a higher intensity, you might only be burning 25% from fat. But if overall you burn 100 calories, that means 25 of those calories were fat. So even from a purely mathematical standpoint, you can see here that the percentage can be misleading. It doesn't really matter what the percentage is, because if you actually look at how much fat is burned, you can burn a whole lot more even working at a lower percentage because you were working at a higher intensity. Give you a few different ways to look at that. You can see here in this graph, we're showing the kilocalories that come from fat on the y-axis. Across the x-axis, we have intensity, essentially, a percent of maximal heart rate. And that first bar represents the zone, right? There's your fat burning zone. Working at about 60% of maximal heart rate, you can see there by the numbers represented on the red bars that this would be the zone with the greatest percentage of calories coming from the substrate of fat. 63% versus 50, 40, 30 as we move our way across. However, if you look at the kilocalories that actually come from fat, even though a greater percentage are coming from there, you're just burning less calories overall, and thus you're getting less. If it still hasn't made sense, let me try one more way here, because I think this is quite visual. I made this one myself. Basically, if I were to offer you a piece of pie, one of those pieces is 33%, another one is 17%, but think about which piece of pie do you actually want? Sure, it might be 17%, which is a lower percent of a bigger pie, but you still get more overall. And that's really what we're talking about. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a percentage of what? It depends on how big that chunk is coming from. Possibly even more important than that is this idea of total caloric expenditure. So great that we can change, even if the percentage goes down, the amount of actual fat being burned changes, but I'm going to suggest that it probably doesn't even matter. And in many ways, I'd say a calorie is a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. So who really cares if you're just burning fat? Because in the end, it doesn't really matter what you're burning. The fact is you're burning energy. Does our body happen to store excess calories as fat? Yes, it does. And it's a really efficient way for our body to do that. But if you think about it, let's say that we're working really hard and we're not burning a whole lot of fat at all. We're burning almost exclusively carbohydrates because we're working at a really high intensity. What do you think happens to your body after you finish that workout? Do we just stay in the glycogen depleted state, assuming we depleted that? Or are we just low in our carb stores because we burn through all of our blood sugar? Of course not. We know that we start to recover. And if we have to replenish those stores, where are we going to get that? Well, we're going to go to our energy stores, which are fat. So our body is going to balance it out after the fact regardless. Now, if anybody really digs into this, are there changes in the way things go with exercise training and the amount we pull from one another? Yes. If we really wanted to get down and debate the nitty gritty, we could. But in the end, it still holds that energy is energy and fat just happens to be where it's stored. So burning fat as the energy source does not mean it's going to be any better for weight loss or whatever that goal might be. This idea that being the fat burning zone is going to be effective doesn't hold when we're talking about things like weight loss. So where do I stand with this women's health article? Not a huge fan. Did find another one actually looking at the same study, and this is from a publication called Science Daily, where they said Talanian notes that faster fat burning and greater overall fitness may not necessarily mean immediate weight loss. Exactly, because he gets this idea of the fat burning zone. Technique may improve someone's potential to burn more fat, but for weight loss, you need to consider the balance of exercise and a healthy diet, which is absolutely true. So can we change our ability to burn fat? Sure can. We actually have a term for that. It's called fat max. How much fat can you actually break down and turn into that usable energy that we want, turn it into ATP? That may matter, but for most people, again, this kind of comes back to maybe just ultra-marathon runners who need to keep going for a long time at a fairly low intensity. It's typically not a beneficial thing. And in fact, for most people that need to do most sports, you probably want to be pretty good at breaking down carbs. So in fairness to women's health, maybe it wasn't this study. Maybe it was another Canadian study they're thinking of. Here we go. Okay, I think I found it. So here's the study. The effects of high-intensity intermittent exercise training on fat loss and fasting insulin levels of young women. You might note that the study was actually done in Australia, but we'll overlook that for now. So what was the study design? Here, a 15-week training, 3 times a week, they were doing interval training, and the hit was all-out pedaling for 8 seconds, then 12 seconds passive pedaling, and they do that 60 times. Steady-state exercise for 45 minutes, and they were doing that at 60% VO2 max, and then they were going to compare what's better, doing low-intensity steady-state, or long and slow just keeps going, or doing this high-intensity interval training. Here they had 3 different groups of subjects, and I'll point out that they were different in that they did not cross over. Each group stuck to their own intervention, so they were either in the control, they were in the steady-state exercise, or they were in the high-intensity interval training. They were overweight, or actually obese subjects in this case, which I think is important to point out. And I'm just going to give you a second. I want you to look at this. So this is the table 1, which is in most papers going to be your demographic data. Who were these people? What did they look like? I want you to take a moment and see if anything jumps out to you from this. Okay, I'm just going to keep going in the video, so if you need a little bit more time, just hit pause, take a look at it, see what you figure out. But here's some of the things I'm going to look at. I'm looking at VO2. How fit are these people? So you can see they've expressed it in both absolute and relative terms there, which is useful. And I can see that they're not what I would consider particularly athletic people. Those aren't the highest VO2s I've ever seen. Next column over, TBM is total body mass in kilograms. So we can see that they're reasonable. They're probably pretty short people, though, because when we look at fat mass in kilograms and percent body fat, we can see that they're relatively high, hence it's done in obese individuals. This may have jumped out to you, because it did jump out to me, that we can see that at pre-training, the high-intensity interval exercise group had fat mass of 22 kilograms or 35% body fat, and about the same for control, and whoop, what's going on here? Interesting to me that the steady-state exercise group was far lower than the others. Now, in this case, it didn't actually come up as significant, but I just want to point that out. That's the kind of thing I'm going to be looking at in one of these, or in any of these studies. Were the groups the same to begin with? Because as you can imagine, if you're looking at weight loss and you have one group that's far skinnier than the others, their chances of losing a significant amount of weight compared to the others is reduced because they don't have as much to lose. That applies to this one, but I think that's an important thing, particularly when we have parallel group designs that we look at in all of these studies. Are they the same? What's the potential bias if they're not? Can we look past it? So something that did kind of jump out to me. So what did they find here? Back on the last one, if you went through it, you can see that they were showing what was the pre, what was the post, and this is really just graphically showing you what's going on in terms of high-intensity interval in black, and the lighter gray in the middle there, we've got our steady-state exercises, and then we've got continuous. And you can see here that this is showing change in fat mass. So only the high-intensity interval group actually saw a decrease in their fat mass. Well, that's interesting. Okay, so maybe there's something to this. This group also used they used what's called dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, or DEXA, which is kind of a neat thing. It uses densitometry, and we can scan with 2 layers of X-rays to figure out what do they have in terms of bone, like bone minerals, what do they have in terms of lean tissue, what do they have in terms of fat tissue. So if you look up at the top, this is what a typical DEXA output looks like, and you can see here scanned with just the bony structure, and then this one beside it is showing soft tissue as well. And you can actually break that down into different regions, which I think is kind of a cool thing about this. It's a neat thing to have done, actually. I'll bring in one of my own, and you can actually take a look at this. It's also terrible to look at because you end up squishing down and you look a shape that you don't really think you look like. But you can see here they took this per group and they did pre-training, post-training, and again they showed, okay, well, what's going on here in terms of how much of the leg is made up of fat tissue, how much is made up of a much denser lean tissue, and they can represent that by weight. You can actually change the units that you use in this, but you can break it down to sort of the peripheral tissue or even here trunk tissue. And this certainly matters because we know people who carry trunk around the viscera, around the gut, it's a higher health risk than those who carry it in other places. And so if we express that data in a different way, you can see here graphically again, only the high intensity interval group lost central abdominal fat. So given that that's the one we probably care about, well, maybe that's a really important thing, that they're losing it from the highest risk area. So here we go, 15 weeks, we've gone from left to right, we've increased our ability to shed belly fat, just like Women's Health was talking about. But wait, hold up a second. Anything wrong with this? Well, it is true that there are exercises that there are certain people that may lose body fat from certain areas, and by getting exercising, we tend to actually lose fat in the opposite order from the way we put it on. So it's possible. It's not spot reduction per se, but what did we see with this? Because we did see that fat losses were better in high intensity interval training in both of those graphs I showed you. What's wrong with this? Well, one thing I want to point out is the scale. I don't know if anybody picked up on this, but the scale here is 0.1 kilograms of fat loss. So just to put that in perspective, that means over 15 weeks or an entire semester, subjects lost 150 grams of fat, or less than half a pound. That wouldn't be detectable by most people on a bathroom scale. So does this really matter? Are we surprised? Well, I think this can be a little bit misleading, right? Because when you look at this graph, you think, holy geez, well, look at that. They did more than double. They lost that. But I'll point out that the gains by the other group in exercise is not always associated with a weight gain, although it can be. And I'll point out that this is actually a gain in fat, not in weight. So it's not that they're becoming, they're not just getting better lean tissue. It's probably noise. It may have to do with changes in diet or whatever it might be, but you can see that they basically gained it almost as much as this group lost. So kind of sketchy. I'd also say, am I really surprised? Well, perhaps not, because I did a little bit of math here. So the study design was 15 weeks, 3 times a week, and the HIIT group did 8 seconds all-out pedaling, 12 seconds passive pedaling. And if you calculate that out, that really means they did 8 minutes of hard exercise and a little bit of pretty passive light exercise in between. Do we really think that they're going to lose that much weight with 8 minutes of exercise? I'm not sure. So when we come back to the original question, how did Women's Health, or really many other popular media outlets, how do they do in presenting this? I'll be honest, it's quite frustrating that some of these groups, Goop is another one. Gwyneth Paltrow is not my favorite person. And in fact, there's a bunch of health experts that specifically just target her because some of the stuff that comes out of that organization is just so terrible. If you're interested in that, Tim Caulfield, who's a Canadian, actually wrote a best-selling book called Is Gwyneth Paltrow Wrong About Everything, which is quite interesting. He has a Netflix series as well where he just goes through and he debunks some of these things. But it's a real challenge that who has the public's attention? And typically it is these big media outlets. So, there's a value in having people who understand science and understand how to interpret results, maybe conveying that when they have the attention of people that are going to listen and are looking for that help. So when we think about high-intensity interval training, I think one of the interesting things to me is that people seem to think this is a new idea. And I'll point out that it's not a new idea at all. It was invented a long, long time ago, in fact, by a phys ed professor and a medical doctor that were working together. And as I showed you before, it's this idea that really, in essence, we just need to work hard, and then we're going to take a break in between, and then we're going to work hard again. But in doing so, the demand on things like the heart and stuff, which we're not talking about as much here, they also go up as well. It's not just about the muscular work that's accomplished and allowing those muscles to recover in between those sets. But if you look at the heart rate, I mean, every time you work out here, obviously heart rate goes up. And in the downtime, heart rate's going to start to recover. And then you're going to hit the next session, it's going to go up again. And you can see that the heart rate over time is actually going to keep going up, assuming you don't completely recover in between. So what happens there is we can actually have a very intense workout, and we can actually hit levels that may not have been possible to do otherwise. So that's really where this came from in an athletic model or an elite model, where they're pushing athletes to do these things that they couldn't do for a prolonged period. Work hard, sort of rest hard, and then keep doing it, and that's kind of how we get there. So that's high intensity interval training in a nutshell. We haven't talked too much about sprint interval training. I will point out this is the group I had sort of alluded to before at McMaster University. They've had a lot of attention on the work they've done. It's been talked about in the New York Times a lot. The 6 minute a day workout was a big thing when it came out. Now it's down to the 1 minute a day workout, and they're talking about taking the stairs or exercise snacks. You might have heard that. And I think it's a really appealing idea because time is the most commonly cited barrier to exercise. I just don't have time. And in some ways, I like that, their answer, and others that are researching this say, okay, so let's not make it last a lot of time. Just work hard and you can get the same kind of benefits. So that's HIIT. What do we see when we look at these sprint interval training? So here's one study by that particular group, and kind of give it away with the title there. You can see we find similar findings when we look at sprint interval training. So their purpose was to compare what are the metabolic changes that happen after 6 weeks if you're doing this sprint interval, so very low volume, really high intensity compared to sort of the Canadian guidelines, which are more endurance training. So recreationally active men and women, they were young women from around McMaster's campus. Sprint intervals looked like 6 times 30-second wind gates. That's not fun. That's a pretty good workout, but it's only 30 seconds at a time. And they did that 3 days a week, as we talked about before. It's about the most you're going to get out of people. And that equated to less than an hour of actual hard work. You compare that to the endurance group, who did an hour each time, fairly low intensity at 65%, and they did that 5 days a week. So they had 30 times the work done as they were doing about 30 hours of work. What did they find here? So here I'm showing you in the white bars was what their pre-values were. Black bars are what their post-values were. And you can see they're comparing sprint interval training versus endurance training on carbohydrate oxidation and fat oxidation. And you can see here that in both of these groups, fat oxidation went up. So training will make fat oxidation go up because you can basically break it down because it's easier to do because you're working at a lower percentage of what you're capable of doing. And we can also see here, so just as a point of clarity, in this paper, this asterisk is showing that post is always different from pre. So we can see that carb oxidation went down and that was replaced by fat oxidation going up. So there was a change. If we look at the citrate synthase activity, oxidative capacity falling either went up. So they got more oxidative, and that really starts to explain some of these differences that we're seeing in substrate use. So at the tissue level, the metabolic level, changes are happening from sprint interval training as well. So that's all well and good. But again, it comes to me, at the coalface, what's happening in terms of performance? And we've seen that we can make people fitter. We can change the way that their body's working under the hood by using HIIT or sit in terms of the muscle level stuff. But what about really trained people? Because they're already at a pretty high level. So is it going to work in performance? This is one of my favorite studies that I'm actually going to show you here. Because typically what happens in the elite circles, they're not just going to switch right over. They're going to take a little bit of what would be their base aerobic training. And here you can see maybe less than 20%. And they're just going to supplement that with, we're going to take out sort of a long run or whatever it might be, and we're going to hit it really hard on that day, maybe once or twice a week to really get the levels up there. So I want to show you this. Let me just orient you to what's going on here first, because I think this is a really cool study that they came out with. So across the bottom here, the x-axis, what they're showing you is the duration, how long things lasted. So 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, or 8 minutes. And you can see here that the intensity expressed as percentage of peak power output is going to be related to the time you did it. So if you're only working out for 30 seconds, you can maintain 175% of your peak power output. If you're working out for a minute, you can do about 100% of your peak power. 2 minutes, it keeps going down. 4 minutes, down, down, down. Okay. So what they did then is they compared, if we train people according to these things, so really short, really hard, or quite long and not as hard, what is the change to their 40-kilometer speed, okay, as a percentage? The 40-kilometer in cycling circles, the 40K time trial is a thing. So that's something that it's a benchmark that makes sense. So you can see the 0 mark represents, that's what you could do already. So did training in any one of these work better than in others? So if you trained doing, so this is like your 30-second wind gate, right? 30 seconds all out. Pardon me, 30 seconds at 175% peak power output, really, but that may be kind of close to all out. You can see that indeed, these 4 cyclists who are well trained to begin with all got a fair bit better. Their speed that they maintain over 40K went up from somewhere between 2 to 4%. Interestingly, though, if you do twice the time, so from 30 seconds to a minute, and you drop the intensity, suddenly it becomes ineffective. The body doesn't feel that stress. It's like, that's something I already do. That's really not going to make me better. And similarly, if you drop the intensity a little bit more and go to 2 minutes, nothing. But if you go to 4 minutes and drop the intensity a little bit more, again, you get a sort of a similar response here, where it's somewhere between roughly 2 and 4, a little bit more of a spread in the athletes there. And this is interesting to me because that says you either have to go all out for a really short period, or you've got to get to that zone where, 1 minute at 100%, yeah, it's not fun, but it's not that bad. 90% for 2 minutes, not that bad. 4 minutes, though, at 85, that starts to suck again. That's really hard to do. By minute 2, which would be the end here, you're really starting to wish it was done, and you still got another 2 minutes to go. And interesting, again, you make it longer, drop the intensity, goes down. So it kind of gets this idea that there's a bunch of different ways we can skin a cat. And what I'm showing you here, this is just taken from a study, but there's almost infinite ways you could set this up, is you can change all sorts of things in interval training. You can make the intensity higher, you can make the rest shorter or longer, you can make the work period longer, all of these things to get at different things that you might want to change. And that probably depends on who you're working with, what your goals are, how you really want to cause that change. So what are some of the other areas when we think about high-intensity interval training? Is it a more practical model? Some would argue that yes, it is. I mean, we talked about this idea of time efficiency. So maybe HIIT is good that way, but are there better ways that we could even be doing HIIT? Should we be doing, as I said, long work to rest ratios? Should we be doing more or less of the high intensity versus low intensity? All those things can be changed. Potentially, if we get that right, maybe there's more people that are actually willing to do it, because HIIT is not an appealing thing for most people. Having said that, there's some really cool data coming out, and some of it's actually been around for a while now, showing that high-intensity interval training could actually be really good for people with chronic disease as well. And I think when that idea was first floated, that was incredibly controversial, because most people, perhaps understandably, thought that if you give that to somebody that has coronary artery disease or has had a heart attack, you are going to kill them. As it turns out, it doesn't. Now, I will say most of these studies were done in hospital settings with a crash cart right there in case something went wrong, and 12 lead ECGs being run. But what was interesting out of that is a lot of it was done on older men who had had heart attacks. And first of all, the old guys actually preferred doing the HIIT group compared to the endurance training, because in their minds, they'd rather just get in, get it done, get out. The other interesting thing in that was the risk to their heart actually went down, because in the endurance group, you get up to 70% of max, and you're stressing the heart, and you're keeping it in that zone for quite a while. Whereas with HIIT training, you can change all those things. So you push it really high, but then you get out of the red zone also quite quickly. And so you can kind of float just below that. So it turns out that in some cases, if it's done right, it may actually be safer. Certainly there's ways, as I just showed you, we can optimize HIIT depending on the population we're working with, and how well trained people are, and how deep into the pain cave do we have to send them is really what we're getting at. But we do need some more long-term follow-up studies. Most studies are fairly short in duration, so will people stick with this over the long time? Do the changes persist beyond the sort of 2 to 6 week window that has most commonly be studied. I find that a really interesting sort of sidebar to that, because a lot of the studies that come out, they go, hey, look at that. We caused the same change in, say, VO2 max as an endurance training. Or maybe we were even better over this period. And the message that is sent is, hey, it's so time efficient. My rebuttal to that would be, well, maybe if it's a race to fitness, if it's how quickly can we get the body to upregulate these things and stimulate those changes, that might matter. But for most people, it's probably not, unless you're maybe underprepared for like an upcoming marathon or something. Is there value in getting there quicker? I'm not sure. I will just finally take a quick aside and say, my group has actually looked at this as well, and we're just preparing a paper now where we flipped the model and we compared high intensity interval training versus endurance training. And we wanted to look at intensity is one thing, but what about frequency? And because you can't do high intensity interval training all that frequently, do you lose something by not sort of constantly nudging the body and reminding it about exercise and telling, hey, we still want to get better at this thing? Quick spoiler, we believe frequency may be very, very important. So I'll tell you more about that study when it comes out. Okay, so real quick application question. Again, I'm going to encourage you can hit pause here, but I want you to think about, you can do it now if your friends are around, if you're watching this together, or if they're not, maybe this is something you can get together. I want you to think about, when would you recommend each of these types of training protocols? When is HIIT or sit or endurance the best thing that you should be doing? So who's your ideal client for that, and why might that be? And when you're thinking about that, I want you to think, what's compliance going to be like? You can fill in some of these blanks in your own mind, but how does that line up with maybe subjects' goals, how they want to perform? Are they racing? Are they just trying to lose weight? Is it that they just want to extend life, be able to move better, all those kind of things that come into actual programming with real people? So maybe play around with some of those factors and see what you come up with. Okay, so let's summarize interval training. Where are we at? Interval training, it can be all sorts of different things. It can look different ways, but the whole idea is we have hard sections, we have light sections. Protocols typically in the literature now range from 30 seconds, where you're going all out, to longer 3 to 5 minute efforts where we're working at a lower percentage of max, but it's still hard. I wouldn't say that the best protocol has been determined, and it's probably very much dependent on who you're working with of what's going to be the best. It is attractive for many people. Rapid alterations, there are a number of people that look at that and say, oh, that sounds terrible, but others that say, yep, great, I can get it over with, I can get it done with, let's do that. I'd also suggest it doesn't have to be polarized. It doesn't have to be black and white. You do this or you do that. Maybe it's something you add in onto what you're already doing, or with your clients, I should say. There is evidence to support a role for high-intensity interval training to induce these peripheral changes in skeletal muscle, and certainly central cardiovascular ones. We didn't talk as much about that, but we know all sorts of things can happen, and they're really driving some of these changes we see in VO2 max as well. Individual preferences, goals, current training habits, all of these things need to be considered when we bring HIIT in or when we sub something else out in a training program. Okay, assigned papers. We're going to be talking about concurrent training. And so I want to give a little bit of background on this. Concurrent training talks about this idea of what happens when we're doing resistance training and we're doing more endurance type training, which has been really the focus of the lecture to this point. One of the things I'll point out, there are very few sports that rely solely on endurance or strength. Usually it's some combination, particularly when we think team sports. There's the power moves and the things, hockey, for example, you get out there, you sprint, you skate really fast, but you also have to have that endurance side so you can recover, get out and do it again. Many stop and go sports are the same way. Even when we think of things that are typically endurance, there is a strength component, whether it's to stay healthy or whatever it might be. So how do we train for both of those things? What does science actually say about when we're trying to train resistance and endurance exercise? So are doing strength and endurance training at the same time incompatible? Despite what we know about overall health, performance, and the fact that we should be doing both of these things, we do see guidelines now say you should be doing this much exercise. Oh, and by the way, you should be lifting weights twice a week. We know there's all sorts of stuff, benefits that come from that. There's a lot of evidence now, growing evidence, that shows participating in high-level endurance training may compromise maximal strength gains that would be achieved if we were doing resistance training alone. So we have a name for this. We call this the concurrent training effect, or you might hear it called the interference effect. And what do we mean by that? Essentially, max strength gains will not get to what they could have been if we're doing endurance training at the same time. Okay? So say it again. Maximal strength gains are impaired. They will not get as high when endurance training is added to a resistance training program. Interestingly, it doesn't appear that it's the same effect when we flip it the other way around. So if you're doing endurance training and you add resistance to that, the resistance training doesn't seem to negatively affect the endurance training. It's really just that resistance training will be blunted when we add that endurance training component to it, which is why you don't see bodybuilders running or cycling or whatever a lot. Molecular responses to a single exercise bout are often measured to better understand what's going on here and how this works. Again, I don't want to make this a biochemistry lecture, but I think there's a few points that we'll point out here and kind of bring back to last class. We talked about the importance of mTOR. Sorry, get rid of that for a second. So here we can see when we lift weights, when we do resistance training, everything comes down. mTOR, we talked about, it plays a key role in leading down here to muscle hypertrophy through protein synthesis. If we look at endurance training, we can see a lot of this stuff comes through, and I guess PGC1 alpha in some ways is the mTOR of endurance training, and we want to get down to mitochondrial biogenesis. But I'll point out here that through AMPK, we have this effect where AMPK is going to affect this modulating variable, and that puts a stop on mTOR. So what that means is if you are resistance training and add endurance training, and this stops one of the key players, you will not end up with muscular hypertrophy. So that comes from John Hawley's paper, which was published in APNM a couple of years ago. So again, why do we not see this very often? Well, first of all, I think that guy's going to get incredible chafing of his lats. But we don't see bodybuilders out running because it's kind of an incompatible thing. I wish that it really was as simple as that graph or that summary that I just showed you, and it all had to do with mTOR, and that is a likely pathway, but of course it's not. We can't just say that, well, you shouldn't run, and we totally understand this, because there's all sorts of things we need to consider in terms of how can we and how can we not put these two things together. We need to consider things like, what order do you do things in? So if you're going to work out, does it matter if you did cardio first and weights second, or if you did weights first and cardio second? Are both going to have the same effect in terms of this interference? What about how long you spent in between it? So let's say that you're exercising in the morning at night, or maybe you're exercising in the morning and then at noon. So if I do weights in the morning and then at noon I do cardio, is that going to have a bigger interference effect than if I'd waited until night to do it, or if I'd waited until the next day? How long is enough before those signals don't start to compete? When we talk about endurance exercise, what is it that actually qualifies for that threshold of where we start to have that interference effect? We really don't understand this very well. Is something like CrossFit training, which we started the lecture off looking at, or any kind of interval training where we're going around, we have this aerobic component to lifting. Does that start to have an interference effect? Again, we really don't know. But getting down to the nitty gritty of the ratio of resistance endurance sessions, what do we get to? And then certainly other things that affect most of these training studies we talk about: training status, the nutrition of the person. What's the endpoint that we're actually measuring? Is it performance? Is it a mechanism? Is it an enzymatic marker? So there are now frameworks that start to try to explain how these things work. I think this is an interesting one, and this actually kind of goes through some of the things we just talked about. So if we're doing aerobic exercise prior to resistance exercise, for example, how might that affect things? Well, they would suggest here that maybe we're causing residual fatigue, or maybe we're just burning through the substrate that's there. And you can see that any of these suggested things could affect these pathways, some more than others. So if we have residual fatigue, maybe that means we can't produce as much force, which means we change the fibers we're activating, which means the resistance exercise just wasn't as good. And then that leads over here to a decreased anabolic response through all of these different things, which the eventual endpoint is less fiber hypertrophy. If we kind of just quickly go through here on the substrate depletion, right? So if we
burn through our energy stores when we don't have as much glycogen. Well, again, maybe we're just affecting force production and we come back through the same pathway. Or maybe if we decrease glycogen, maybe we're decreasing the anabolic response. So maybe the muscle doesn't respond the same way, and then back down here, the end result being less fiber hypertrophy. I don't think this is a perfect solution either. We still need to understand, the dose response really of all those things, but it is a framework to start working from. So with that, I'm going to put up the assigned readings. You can see here we have one from the UK and Keith Barr's group, understanding molecular signaling to optimize concurrent training. And another one from the same year, starting to get this idea of, does the order of exercises matter? Weights before cardio or cardio before weights? And with that, I'm going to say thanks for listening. I hope that wasn't too painful having it online, but I will get all the materials up there. And reminder, next week you will be back in class with Jeremy and Megan.